A war has been raging on European soil for 2 years now. Despite the possibility of escalation, why is defence and security spending not keeping up with the very real threat from Russia? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. It can be difficult to justify military spending during times of relative peace. But after the war in Ukraine started, Western allies promised to ramp up resources. And French President Emmanuel Macron has now suggested he might be prepared to send troops to Ukraine. So why, 2 years in, are they not meeting basic funding pledges?
This is what a successful launch of the UK's nuclear-capable Trident missile should look like. But a test in January failed following another failure in 2016. The Minister of Defence said it was an anomaly and maintained that the government has absolute confidence that the UK's deterrent remains effective, dependable and formidable. Nevertheless, this event has called into question the UK's military readiness. The Army employs only 76,000 active personnel, down from 113,000 in 2010. While 2 Navy frigates had to be decommissioned early due to a lack of staff, all at a pivotal moment.
Today, our adversaries are busy rebuilding their barriers. Old enemies are reanimated. New foes are taking shape. Battle lines are being redrawn.
The UK is a top contributor to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and consistently hits its obligatory military spending of 2% of GDP. Understandably, countries closest to Russia spend more, but all EU nations are upping their defense budgets.
In 2024, NATO allies in Europe will invest a combined total of $380 billion in defense. For the first time, this amounts to 2% of their combined GDP. So we are making real progress.
Many argue, though, that this money is simply fixing existing issues and not planning for future readiness. And this compares to Russia's plans to spend 6% of GDP on its military in 2024. What's undeniable? Preparing for war is less expensive than actually participating in one. So can NATO allies do enough now to prevent the worst later down the road?
Well, let's meet our guests. Joining us from Edinburgh in Scotland, we have Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Crawford. He is a former British Army officer and now a defence analyst. In The Hague is Jamie Shea, a former Deputy Assistant Secretary General of NATO. And here with me in the studio is Elizabeth Braw. She is a Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council and author of the new book, Goodbye Globalisation. A warm welcome to Roundtable to all of you. Jamie, I want to begin by looking at the recent comments by the French President Emmanuel Macron about possibly sending troops into Ukraine and the response that that has brought from the Kremlin. I mean, is this quite worrying?
Well, I think it reflects President Macron's increasing sense of urgency about European support to Ukraine. He's seen the hold-up in the American Congress on the aid package. He's seen the fact that Ukraine is now being pushed back by Russia, including the loss of another village this morning in the Donbass. So the Russians are certainly taking advantage of the fact that Ukrainians seem to be running out of ammunition. And France recently, just a week ago, signed its own bilateral security and defense pact with Ukraine and is offering billions more euros and lots more French weapon systems. So it's good that France is really stepping up alongside Germany. But I don't think that what President Macron means is that NATO or the EU are going to send combat forces to fight alongside Ukrainians in the trenches. And NATO Secretary General today, Jens Stoltenberg, has said that there are no NATO plans to do that. That's the kind of escalation which the United States and NATO have ruled out since the beginning of the conflict 2 years ago. But he could be applying certain other things, like, for example, Western military personnel or contractors might help Ukraine to repair its equipment, service the equipment, might do some training inside the country, in the rear lines, for example, might send more military advisors, those kind of things. I mean, many armies use private sector contractors, of course, to, as we saw in Iraq or Afghanistan, to maintain that equipment. So we'll have to wait and see exactly what President Macron has in mind. But I really do not believe that this represents a step change in the sense that NATO is now going to get directly involved in the war in Ukraine vis-a-vis Russia and expand that war. And I think the great majority, whatever President Macron means, I think the great majority of allies, including President Biden, would rule that out.
Stuart, are we at quite a dangerous time for the rest of Europe? Obviously, Ukraine has been through hell for 2 years. Are we at a tipping point for the continent?
Well, I mean, I think the answer is we're at a more dangerous point than we were perhaps 3 years ago. But I don't think at the moment there's any real chance of a general conflict involving more European countries, and particularly NATO countries, against Russian aggression, unless that, of course, manifests itself in some other way. Just on the point of President Macron's sort of saber rattling, if you like, about putting NATO troops on the ground in Ukraine. As your previous guest has just said, there are NATO troops on the ground already in Ukraine. I mean, it would be astonishing if there weren't, but they'll be there in a training and advisory capacity, including elements of special forces of many NATO countries, just making sure that they're at least assisting and advising the Ukrainian armed forces in their fight against Russia. I don't think we're at a tipping point, but I do think that the temperature has risen over the past couple of years, and the way that the Baltic states and Poland and Finland and now, thank goodness, Sweden have rallied to NATO, if you like, I think is indicative that people are well aware that we're not in such peaceful circumstances as perhaps we were before the 2022 invasion of Crimea.
Elizabeth, I want to look at an interview that the Denmark Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, gave recently, where she used the word naive about European defence spending in recent years. And she made the point that basically saving loads of cash on defence to give people tax cuts or to invest in healthcare. She said lots of countries have done this, and the one word she used was naive. Has she got a point?
She does, but we also have to remember that in the early 2000s, all the way up to 2022, really, or at least 2014, the world looked quite harmonious. And obviously, now we can say, oh, yeah, that was incredibly naive. There was always going to be a clash between countries. And that's also what I explore in my book. It was globalization went well for a number of years. But then, you know, the more time you spend together, the more you realize that actually there are things that you don't like about the other side. And then you start rubbing each other the wrong way. And that's what happened. And now that is accelerating. But I think it would be unfair to call the politicians who cut defense in the 90s and early 2000s naive. But then once it became clear that the harmony that we had in the early post-Cold War years, that it was not going to last, then it was naive to assume that, oh, we here in Europe don't need to spend that much because America will always come through for us. And so on that point, she was right. And certainly in more recent years, in the past 3, 4, 5 years, there have been some countries in Europe who have definitely been free riders out of naivety or out of cynicism. But
who would you say has been taking a free ride?
Well, I encourage your viewers to go to NATO's website and check the defense spending. There are quite a few countries that are quite a few notches below 2% and even below 1.5%. But then we should also remember that it doesn't mean that if you spend upwards of 3% like Greece does, it doesn't mean that you're the star performer of NATO because you can spend it on things that aren't that terribly useful to the alliance.
Jamie, let's get it out of the way. Let's talk about Russia. What is Putin's plan? I mean, is he going to stop at Ukraine, or do you think he's got more ambitious plans, should we say?
Well, under Putin, I mean, Russia has sort of occupied a considerable chunk of Georgia. It has kept its forces in Moldova, although Moldova is not seeking to join NATO. It's put nuclear weapons in Belarus and a substantial portion of the Russian army also in Belarus. And of course, it's invaded Ukraine on 2 occasions, as Elizabeth pointed out. First of all, 2014, the annexation of Crimea, the first Russian push into eastern Ukraine. And now, of course, since February 2022. And it's not just that sort of performance. It's also the fact that Putin has has turned Russia into a Soviet-style war economy, where the bulk of industry has been converted to war production. Hundreds of thousands have been conscripted into the Russian armed forces, allowing Russia to have as many as 650,000 troops in Ukraine, where school kids are once again undergoing military training. It's really guns and it's not butter. It's what some British experts call a Kalashnikov economy. And so if you're in Europe, it doesn't really matter what Putin is planning next. You probably are not going to be able to guess anyway, because it's inside his head. And he certainly is not going to tell you, because he promised fervently that he was not going to invade Ukraine. And we know what happened to that. But so you don't really need to sort of try to do criminology in terms of guesswork. You simply have to look at the facts and say, well, look, am I prepared to live with that level of risk and such a dangerous Russia as my neighbor, and not take out an adequate insurance policy along the lines that my two colleagues on the program today were discussing. So, don't worry about intentions. Just look at the capabilities, and that tells you all you need to know.
Stuart, do you think Putin is looking at a greater Russia, and that if he grinds his way to any kind of a victory in Ukraine, that's the plan?
Oh, definitely he's looking at a recreating, if you like, greater Russia in the idiom of perhaps the former Soviet Union, but it's not going to come to that, I don't think. Ukraine is one option, and he may well end up prevailing in Ukraine. Personally, I don't think the Russians will win, but I don't know exactly what the end state there will be. But I don't think that Putin has any desire whatsoever to enter into a general conflict with NATO, for the simple reason that NATO's military power is overwhelming, and Russia would lose, and lose badly, and he knows that. That does not, however, prevent him from rattling the cage and pushing the parameters of irritation and threatening to the West, up until the point where the West says to him, that's enough, and no further shall you go. And we haven't quite got there yet. But I think the accession of Sweden in particular to NATO, which now turns the Baltic Sea into a NATO lake, and Russia's options through St. Petersburg and Kaliningrad are now extremely limited in terms of military access to the North Sea and the North Atlantic. I think that changes things quite a bit. And of course, Sweden has brought a considerable military capability into the NATO arsenal, which is most welcome.
It's a very good point, Elizabeth. I should tell our viewers you are Swedish. So what's your observation on your country joining NATO and the whole Russian situation?
It has been a remarkable turn of events until 2 years ago, almost to the day. It didn't seem possible for Sweden to join NATO because the government at that point was not keen on joining NATO, and it had always said that we will only join if Finland joins, and knowing that Finland would never want to join, and then all of a sudden public opinion in Finland shifted dramatically, and Sweden then decided that, well, if the Finns are keen to join, we will have to join too. And then came this unexpected turn where Finland was let in very quickly, and Sweden had to wait much longer, but also, well, that ends well, and it's about to end because Hungary has just become the final country to vote to ratify Sweden's accession. So within the next few days, Sweden should be able to hoist its flag at NATO headquarters, and that will bring significant capabilities to NATO, not just territory from which NATO forces can operate, but also skills. Sweden has a long and proud history of strong defense, especially defense involving the whole country. It's not as strong as it used to be, but nevertheless, the tradition is there, and the skills to some extent are still there. It has a strong air force, it has a strong navy, relatively strong, could be stronger. And so all of that is a benefit to NATO. This is good news for Sweden, obviously, that has finally happened, but I think even better news for NATO, actually.
And no reservations about spending in Sweden? You will meet 2% of GDP on defence?
So this government, which succeeded the previous government of Social Democrats, is very committed to defence spending and has increased defence spending considerably. Just a few months ago, it increased defence spending by 28% in one swoop, which is quite significant. So So I think it's moving very rapidly to 2%. But again, what really matters is how well you spend that money. And this government seems to have a keen eye for where the money needs to be spent.
I want to talk about the United Kingdom, and I'm going to read a piece to you which was written by Tim Collins, former British Army officer, former SAS guy. It's an opinion piece he wrote in the Daily Telegraph in London, and it was scathing of where the UK Defence Forces are right now. Let's take a look at what he said. He said, what remains of the army is barely workable. Of the 72,000 in its workforce, around half have been medically downgraded. The drive to introduce females into frontline units carrying combat loads over long distances has, not surprisingly, taken a shocking toll on their frames. The state of the army equipment is perilous too. We effectively have no artillery systems since the AS-90s were given to the Ukrainians, along with a lump of the ammo, and the new system is not in service. A disastrous defence procurement programme has reportedly seen just 44 of an ordered 589 armoured fighting vehicles delivered to the MOD, a decade after bosses signed a £5.5 billion contract. Jamie, Tim Collins, he is a soldier, he is a fighting man, he has served, he knows what he's talking about. That's quite a damning assessment.
Well, there's no doubt about it that turning a defence budget into effective capability, in other words, well-trained troops, modern equipment, a good balance between navies, air forces and armies, that's not so easy. And the UK, I certainly agree with Tim in the area of procurement, has had enormous number of problems in delivering a long-term and highly expensive defence contracts, particularly for big platforms like aircraft or aircraft carriers. So that needs to be looked at. I think it's a legitimate question. Why is it that France, that spends an equivalent amount to the UK on defence, has a much larger army, more ships and more planes in the Air Force? And it's not just a question of quantity over quality. I think the UK, as looking forward, is going to have to make some hard choices, particularly looking at NATO and looking at its global security commitments. Will it sort of look more to specialise in maritime forces because it has to guard the Atlantic, it has to guard the Baltic Ocean, be present in the Mediterranean. It wants to project to the Indo-Pacific. It has the AUKUS deal on submarines with Australia. So will it really sort of privilege the Navy and the maritime role, and therefore inevitably need to cut back on the Air Force or the Army? But it does have in Estonia, under NATO, this commitment to provide a reinforced brigade structure in a conflict situation, and it's taken the lead there. So when you've got this situation, either two things happen. Either you cut back or you spend a lot more money and more efficiently on defence. Liz Truss, during her short-lived prime ministership, was talking about 3%. Poland, for example, has decided that the only way it can solve this problem is to spend 4% of GDP on defence. The UK historically was spending 4 to 5% throughout much of the Cold War, and that was accepted as the norm. What we've found is that defence has gone down, but the UK is spending 4 times more now on social welfare programmes than it was just 20 years ago. So a defence review has to be serious. Either budgets go up or capabilities have to go down. But you're right, Tim is right in terms of some of those procurement, administrative, management problems need to be looked at as well.
Stuart, Europe needs a strong UK military, doesn't it? I mean, Jamie just mentioned Poland. They've ramped up to 200,000 members of their armed forces. The plans to go to 300,000, and the UK seems to be dwindling. They just can't recruit people.
Yes, well, I think that's a very accurate observation. I just have to say that I know Tim Collins extremely well from our service in the army together at various staff colleges and things. And his article is very much Tim Collins, that he doesn't hold back when it comes to his opinion, and rightly so. And you may know that he's actually a candidate in the general election this coming year for the Ulster Unionist Party in Northern Ireland. And let's just hope he gets into Parliament so that he can make his views on military matters more influential and widespread. But he's absolutely right. Poland will probably be above 4% of GDP spending. The UK has been around 2.1, 2.2 for the past wee while. And Rishi Sunak has said that our defence budget will go up to 2.5% of GDP. when circumstances allow. Now, that could mean anything to anybody. My personal view is that the UK has traditionally relied on the Royal Navy for national defence and defence of the homeland, and since 1918, increasingly on the Royal Air Force. And the Army has always been a small professional force, colonial policing and expeditionary in times of national emergency, like the First and Second World Wars. But there's no doubt that we're not only are we not spending sufficient amount of money, but we're not spending it wisely. And Tim referred to the 5.6 billion contract for the Ajax armored reconnaissance vehicles placed some 8 years ago, if not more than that, of which 44 have been delivered so far, with over £4 billion of that 5.6 billion already spent. And it's just not good enough, to be perfectly honest. I've worked in the UK defence procurement, and it is mired in the 1950s. It follows the principles of a cottage industry. And despite call year after year after year for the whole system to be reformed, successive governments have done nothing. And it will continue to be the way it is until someone takes the bull by the horns and sorts it out.
That's quite a staggering assessment, isn't it? Mired in the 1950s. People think of the UK military. They used to be world leading. I mean, Sunak and his people need to get a grip, don't they?
They do, but I think that the challenge is that in the UK in particular, there is this expectation that the military will be able to do anything we ask them to do, and they are really good, and they are deployed to serve wherever they are needed, whether that be piling sandbags after flooding here in the UK, or going to the Red Sea to try to deter the Houthis. But the conversation hasn't been had with the public about what sort of investment we need in order to maintain this capability that is really larger than a country of the size of the UK would ordinarily have. So if you want to keep punching above your weight, which is, I think, the idea that the UK wants to do that, then the conversation has to be had with the public about this is what we'll need in terms of financial commitment to make that happen.
Jamie, quite a few elections around the world this year, quite a few elections in Europe. Defence never gets a look in, really, does it? I mean, it's always cost of living, economy, mortgages, interest rates. What have you done for me and my family? Defence never seems to be a priority. Do you think this might be the year that might change?
Well, I certainly think our populations have woken up to the fact that we live in a more dangerous world. You could see the way in which UK politics, UK society has been really mobilised, for example, when it comes to the situation in Gaza at the moment. You can see the enormous support that the UK public gave to Ukraine, and which is still there, as reflected in opinion polls. The enormous number of refugees that were welcomed into the homes of British people, the ongoing support for NATO. And when you ask people about defence spending, providing the arguments are well made, they recognise that they can't bury their heads in the sand and we live in a more dangerous world. But as again my two colleagues were saying, that support will only last as long as governments demonstrate that they're spending the money wisely, they're getting value for money and so on. Defence industries, for example, in the European Union, contribute nearly 500,000 jobs also in the economy. The defence innovation could be a powerful driver of innovation. So there are, I think, arguments to be made. Yes, I do think that although, yes, we're going to fight the general election on the state of the economy, whether the Chancellor next week is going to offer some tax cuts in the budget, inflation. Nonetheless, these foreign policy issues are creeping in. And I think that, governments will do well to be seen to be leading rather than following on this issue.
And Stuart, while European leaders are having conversations internally about defence spend, Putin just keeps going. I mean, he must be laughing at people.
Well, I think the Russian economy is now more or less on a war footing, and they've ramped up production of ammunition and military supplies and scoured the world for additional supplies. So I think that he will feel at the moment that he's not losing in terms of that. Whether the Western European defence industrial base is able to ramp up sufficiently quickly to support both Ukraine in its continuing war against Russia, and also to replenish the stocks which have already been sent to Ukraine, is another matter altogether. And I think actually the European countries are struggling. I think they're getting there, but they're struggling. So Putin will not feel at all threatened, particularly not in his ambitions in Ukraine, although that's obviously proved to be a much more difficult task than he initially thought it would be, one assumes. And but no, I don't think he'll be too worried, but he will be very wary of direct confrontation with NATO for the reasons that we've discussed previously, because Russia is no match for NATO if the sleeping giant of NATO awakes and decides to take him on.
Elizabeth, Stuart and Jamie, thank you all for your insight. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Just search for Roundtable TRT World. And if you like what you see, please do hit that subscribe button. But for now, from me and Brady and all of the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.